In this video, we're going to install a second inverter in parallel with the system that we installed in the last video. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Like in the previous video, the first step that we're going to do is install the mounting bracket. Again, the arrow is going to point up. These cleats are going to grab to the back of the inverter, very similar to how they grabbed into the GridBOSS. So go ahead and get that mounted now. With the mounting bracket installed on the wall, I recommend that you don't tighten them up all the way just yet, as it's going to give you a little bit of play here to mount it center of the battery. So find about where center is, or you can go ahead and measure the conduit box and then get your measurements up here. But the important thing with this is, you're probably wondering what the distance from the top of the battery. Now, this is the 314 amp hour battery with an outdoor conduit box. And I'm sitting at around 21 3/8 of an inch from the top of the conduit box to the bottom of the mounting bracket here. In terms of the top of the conduit box to the top of the cleat, I'm sitting at around 26.5. So if that helps, keep that in mind. But these systems do also come with an X bracket to help you line up the exact height measurements you need. And we have all of that in the installation manual. Now, we're going to go ahead and tighten this up, but we'll get this to about the center that we're looking for. And with that, the cleats give you a little bit of back and forth on the side to ensure that you can get it as centered as possible. But as long as you're in the rough center, you should have no problems getting the inverter lined up. All right, we've gone ahead and got the inverter installed on the wall. Now, this thing does weigh quite a bit, so make sure you have at least 2 people, 3 if you can, to get the inverter mounted on the wall. So, with that being said, inside here, the reason I say that as long as you get it roughly in the center, you should be just fine. We're a little bit off, but all we have to do is push the inverter until our conduit knockouts line up. Then we can go on and insert the plastic inserts to fill up the conduit space here. With the inverter lined up and the conduit knockout plastic inserts put in, go ahead and make sure that you also install the L brackets to mount it securely to the wall. With our hybrid inverter installed, we can go ahead and start running our AC cables, which is going to connect the inverter to the GridBOSS, as well as our battery cables to supply power to the inverter, and PV cables if you have them. Now, something that I recommend doing as you go through each conduit box is to grab some extra tape here and just mark INV2 or some identification mark, so that way you can keep the cable separate for inverter 1 versus inverter 2. It just helps keep up with maintenance and troubleshooting in the long run. So we're going to go ahead and install our wires here. If you want to know how to do that, we made a whole video on this in the previous one, so go ahead and check that out where we discuss how to wire an inverter to a GridBOSS. Now, when it comes to wiring the second inverter to the GridBOSS, the only difference is we're just going to use the next available port, which is going to be hybrid inverter port number 2, as one's already taken by the first inverter. We're also going to adjust the rapid shutdown cable, as well as the paralleling cables here, but we'll get to more on that here in just a minute. So we've wired up our AC wires from our inverter number 2 to the GridBOSS. Now, if you have an existing system like we have today, then you'll need to remove one of the communication cables from the primary inverter to the GridBOSS. Again, in the last video, we wired up 2 just in case one of them got disconnected. We still have the other to operate. We need a smaller cable, as we will be connecting inverter number 1 to inverter number 2, and then that longer cable that used to feed inverter number 1 back to the GridBOSS will now use it from inverter number 2 to the GridBOSS. Now, if that sounded like a mouthful, we'll show you what to do next. All right, we'll start with our smaller cable, and we'll go ahead and open up our inverters and conduit boxes, and all we're doing is feeding this cable and connecting it to the second parallel port on our primary inverter, and routing it over to our secondary inverter, and plugging it up to one of the 2 parallel COM ports. I like to connect it to the far left port. And come in here and clean up the cables here in just a minute. And now we'll take this longer cable and feed it from the inverter number 2 to the GridBOSS. Now, if you have a third inverter, you would just daisy chain inverter to inverter to inverter. And then the last port, like we're doing here, will go back to the GridBOSS. And the master inverter or the primary inverter will connect to the GridBOSS as well. So you'll have 2 inverters connected to the GridBOSS. If you have 3, the middle one will just connect the 2 inverters together. Now over in our GridBOSS, again, we have 2 parallel ports just like the inverters do, and we're just going to connect it to the next open one, like so. And again, what that's doing is creating that closed loop for the communication, and we'll have an image on the screen so that way you can see exactly what we're talking about. And again, all we're doing is connecting that cable that we just connected to the GridBOSS to the last inverter in our string of paralleled inverters here. Now, I'm going to go ahead and clean up the wires here. As you can see, they're a little bit of a mess. We'll jump to the part where I'm discussing rapid shutdown with the second inverter. So now that we're at the rapid shutdown part, there's really not a whole lot that you have to do. It's really just unplugging and reconnecting the same wire. I'm going to get these communication cables out of the way. This is not a mandatory part of the process. But all we're doing is taking the jumper cable for our rapid shutdown wire. We're taking the far right port, which is going to be the positive 12. If you look at the bottom of the terminal. And all I'm doing is I'm jumping it over to the second from the right port here, which again is going to say RSD power positive 12. And I'm just going to open the jaws, push it in, and all we did was use the exact same jumper, just removed the cable, moved it over 1, 2, 3, 4 to the right, and plugged it back in. With our wiring out of the way, we can go ahead and discuss the startup procedure. Now, very similar to what we did in the first video, we're going to make sure that the battery breakers on the inverter are on or closed. The first one's on, the second one's on, and then very similarly, we're going to start turning on the BMSs. We should see that the LED lights, the LED indicators, start to flash, and we're going to let it initialize. And once it's done, we'll go ahead and move to the next battery. You can tell when it's done whenever the lights stop blinking. And again, we'll let this one initialize. It's important to let them boot up separately, as the auto ID feature will need to assign itself as the master or the primary battery. And then once the secondary batteries start coming online, it will assign them IDs down the line. Now, with all the BMSs initialized, we can go ahead and start closing or turning on the battery breakers here. So the system's online now, and you may notice that we have a fault and a warning indicator. Now, these systems were previously set up to work in parallel, and so with the system operating like this, what's happening is they're not seeing each other. You'll probably be experiencing something similar to this, as the inverters will detect that there are the communication lines and they can read each other, and so they're not going to output power until they're properly configured, and we'll get to that here in just a moment. If your inverters are set up in parallel mode, you'll need to make sure that 1, they can see each other through parallel communications, but also 2, electrically, as they'll want to sync up their phases and voltages. Now, we still have our fault and warning indicator, and that's probably because the GridBOSS isn't on, so I'm going to go ahead and add grid power to the GridBOSS and get it powered on, and we'll meet you back when everything's operating. You can see that the system's online, but not quite operational. We can see that we have a warning and a fault indicator, and that doesn't mean that something's wrong with the system, but it does mean that we need to look into it. What's happening is the inverters are seeing each other through a communication signal, and they're not wanting to output any power because they're not getting their voltages or frequencies lined up. So no relays are closed and nothing's being powered yet. I recommend that you don't close any breakers to allow them to see each other electrically just yet. If you do, there's nothing that will happen. It's just for best practices. Now, with that being said, what we're going to do is head over to the system commissioning portal or the EG4 monitoring portal to get everything set up online. Okay, so on the monitoring portal, what we're going to do is set these systems up in primary and secondary mode. So you need to identify which inverter is going to be the primary inverter and which one you'd like to be the secondary inverter. Now, I recommend going off the ports that you used in the GridBOSS. So I'm going to find the serial number on the side of the inverter and go to the maintenance tab. Now, on the maintenance tab, again, click the read button, most importantly. And what we're going to do is we're going to scroll down to the application setting under advanced setting. And we are going to see here that we have a set system type. It says one phase master. What we're going to do is select the slave option and click Set. Now we can see that it said set successfully. And with that, there's a few additional things that we need to make sure are set with this inverter. We need to make sure that the GridBOSS enable is enabled. This parallel setting data sync is going to make sure that the inverters, whichever inverter, if you change settings on one, it will change the setting on the other. If you don't want that to happen, disable this setting, but I recommend that it's enabled for the operation of the system. Another thing we need to look at is this share battery option here. If your inverters are sharing the same battery bank like we have in our setup, we're going to want to make sure that that is enabled. If the batteries are on separate buses or the inverters have separate battery banks, you can disable this option and they will work entirely separately in terms of charge control. Thank you all so much for watching the video. Please don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. If you'd like to see any other content that we can help you with, feel free to reach out to us in the comments. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.